If you're part of an HOA or a management company, you've probably heard of a reserve study, or sometimes referred to as a capital reserve study or a structural reserve study. But the question is, do you actually know how to read one? So this video is going to help you understand how to read a reserve study or how to understand what's inside of a reserve study. So I'm going to walk through one. I've obviously redacted a lot of information in here just because I don't know that this particular community wants their information available. So a reserve study is really just this long-term financial plan where they break down all of the community's shared assets, right? They're going to look at everything from your clubhouse, your pool, to whether or not you have water retention or water management systems. There's all sorts of things that's collectively owned by the community. And what a reserve study does is it maps that stuff out, usually over the course of a 20 or 40-year period of time, to give you an indication of what needs to be replaced when, right? So you can look at and say in 10 years, we have to replace the clubhouse roof, or in 7 years, we have to replace the pool filter, things like that. And it will also give you a good idea of what it's roughly going to cost during that period of time. So I'm going to draw your attention over here to this reserve study. We're going to take a look at a few items. Even though every reserve study specialist or provider is going to prepare this somewhat different, they're not all going to look the same. By no means, in fact, many of them look very different than this. But more or less, the information is very similar. It might be formatted differently or be less granular, but by and large, a lot of the information will be pretty consistent. Who typically uses reserve studies, right? Who typically looks at this type of stuff? Well, a reserve study is generally conducted by the board of an HOA or a condo association. So essentially, a board is going to receive this and understand what the financial plan looks like for the community. So they understand their shared assets and what the projections look like. And the problem is, many of them will get this information back, but they don't really understand how to implement this stuff. I have spent literally dozens of hours, upwards of hundreds of hours, looking at different reserve studies and breaking them down as part of our plan of building out our software. But the purpose of this video is just to give you an understanding of how to actually read a reserve study. So what is a reserve study? Well, a reserve study is generally going to come with more or less a few different categories of things. You're going to have the financial measurement, right? They're going to look at the financial state of the community, how much you have currently in reserves. They're going to look at how much you collect in dues every month or quarter or year, your budget. They're going to look at also all of your community's asset. They're going to look at, do you own a clubhouse? Do you own a pool? Do you own tennis courts? They're going to break that down even further. So you might own a clubhouse, but that clubhouse also has a roof, it has windows, it has a bathroom, it has a kitchen. So there's all these subcategories. The pool isn't just a pool, it's going to have pool decks, pool filters, pool chairs, all these kind of different elements within an asset. And they're going to look at your financial state, your current assets, and then provide a map of what it is you need to save or allocate towards your reserves over the course of time, so that you can maintain the community's financial health, but also the actual infrastructure and the beautification of the neighborhood. So this section, again, it might look a little bit different in your particular reserve study, but this section here is going to be looking at the financial plan of the community and determining if there are changes that need to be made to your particular community. They'll also look at your cash flow and do an analysis of how much money they project you will have, or how much money they think that you're going to need based on the upcoming needs. And then they're going to do a schedule. Essentially, they're going to map out, like I said, over the 20 or 40 years, what are all the things that need to be changed. You can see this particular one breaks it down by asphalt, concrete, sidewalks, storm drainage, landscaping, concrete, etc. All of these different things. And we'll look at some of this stuff just to kind of give you an idea of how they map it out and what the recommended maintenance schedule is. Essentially, what they're going to do is give you a financial plan for what needs to be replaced when, based on the current condition of the actual asset. There'll also be some other things in there that you may or may not find useful. I will say that the photographs are helpful in a lot of situations, so you can kind of understand exactly what this particular study is talking about. While every community's reserve study, or every reserve study provider, will deliver this to an HOA in different formats, by and large, they're going to have a lot of this same pieces of information in here. And depending on the level of service that you get and the reputation of the actual reserve study provider, it may go into more specific detail or be very vague. I've read many that are very detailed and almost overwhelmingly detailed, and others that are quite vague where you're struggling to understand, how do I even break this down? There's just not a whole lot of relevant information. So here you can see that a reserve study oftentimes comes with a lot of what's known as just the narrative around it. They like to talk about the community and give context and almost write it in a story form way, which I think sometimes is helpful for those type of people to know the context of everything. But a lot of this stuff doesn't really get useful until you start looking much further down here at these spreadsheets. But we'll look at this real quickly up here just so you have an idea of what's in it. So here you can see that they're talking about the methodology and the assumptions, right? So you can say that they are typically looking at items that are limited with a useful life of less than 30 years. You can see here that they're talking about the schedule of this one. Here you can see they're looking at the method that they've used. They call this the cash flow method. In comparison, there's also what's known as a component funding, which we'll talk about a little bit. This particular reserve study is assuming the cash flow method. And you can see here that they actually state what's the goal. The goal of this funding is to keep the reserve cash balance above zero. Essentially, they want to make sure that your community never gets into a situation where you don't have enough money to actually meet the needs of the community, that there might be things coming up, expenses coming up, and if you have no money in your reserves, you're having to do what's known as a special assessment, which nobody really wants to do. So they map this out assuming that they can help build up your reserves enough to prevent a special assessment from happening. Here they also talk about the level of service. They talk about how this is a full study, a full service study as defined by the National Reserve Standards. Essentially what they're saying here is some communities will elect to have updates or a remote study done, so they might just send in pictures or talk with somebody over a Zoom and kind of give them an idea of what their community has. Obviously, the most robust form of doing this is having a full service on-campus study where an engineer and other people will come out and look at everything. Sometimes they'll even bring construction people in who will understand what does it cost or what's the condition of something. So in this case, this particular community paid for a level 2 full service study, and you can see that they say the common component inventory was established based on information provided by the association's representative, field measurements and or drawing takeoffs. So they likely did a hybrid of being on site, walking the property, looking at the conditions of everything themselves, measuring stuff themselves, but a board member also probably submitted documentation to give them an idea of the various things that's owned by the community. And with this, if you just want a quick answer of where we are, how is our financial health, a lot of that's going to be found in this executive summary portion or this narrative here. So if you just need a quick understanding of what we're looking at, how much do we need to increase our dues by, what are the major issues that's coming up, a lot of that's going to be found here. And then, of course, they're going to provide generally a technical definition or some form of a glossary, right? And in here, they're talking about what's a quantity, what's a unit cost. You can see I highlighted this, the RS Means Company. This is a company that essentially aggregates all the data in the construction industry. So they're not having to go in there and individually source what does it cost to replace a roof that's, 500 square feet or what's the cost of asphalt, right? They just log into this company, they have an account there, and they plug all this information in, and this company actually aggregates the data to tell them what the cost is per unit measured. So these two definitions right here are actually going to be very useful if you're not familiar with this. They map out what's known as the estimated useful life and the estimated remaining life. Essentially what they look at is they look at the current condition of something and say, is this thing in good condition, right? So let's say a roof at the clubhouse or the pool. They'll look at it and say, what's the current condition of this? Is it falling apart? Is it needing immediate repair? or does it look like it still has 5, 10, 15 years left that we can continue to use this thing without it falling apart? And they will compare that to what the actual estimated life is, the estimated useful life. So you've got the remaining life, but you also have the useful life. So let's just take an average roof. An average roof might last 15 years. Some higher quality roofs might last longer. A cheaper roof, or one that's been on the actual clubhouse for a decade, may only have 5 years left. So they're comparing the the state of it, the current condition of it, with the expected life of it, and giving you the delta between that to say this particular item needs to be replaced in 3 years, or whatever the fact might be. So here you can see that they're factoring a 3% compound inflation rate, which may or may not be true. Yes, generally speaking, 3% might be somewhat accurate, but you know that things fluctuate. Like during the height of COVID, the cost of lumber was exorbitantly more than what it typically is. Or currently, with recent news about tariffs in the aluminum industry or the steel industry, 3% isn't going to be nearly enough. So there might be items that are found in this reserve study that when this was conducted, a 3% inflation was accurate, but today it may be totally inaccurate because the cost of this particular item that they're talking about might be considerably more. And then you can see here that it's their understanding that the reserve account for the community has a balance of approximately $57,000 with an annual contribution of $20,000, which essentially is the equivalent to $17 per month per house, right? This particular community, I don't know that it says, but I think it has roughly 104, 105 homes, less than 110, I think it is. And so if they're putting roughly $17 per month per house into reserves over the course of a year, they're contributing about $20,000 based on that. And you can see here, they say, based on the capital reserve analysis, the current annual contribution for reserve fund has been found to be inadequate to provide for future expenses as projected by this analysis. It's our recommendation that the association dues be increased so the annual contribution of $40,000 is achieved. So they're currently only putting $20,000 in. You can see here that they're recommending that they put $40,000 in. So how do you actually look at this thing? So here you can see that they break this down based on rather than location within a community, or even what we would consider to be like the community's assets or the community's amenities. I might talk about it in terms of the clubhouse, but they're going to talk about it in terms of site work or exterior, interior buildings of things, or electrical, mechanical, and plumbing items. So they might break things down differently. And again, every reserve study provider might do this slightly different. But essentially what you can see is they're going to list out all of these things, and they're going to say, okay, what's the unit of measurement? How many numbers of that unit do they want? What's the average cost? This right here is stuff that fluctuates quite a bit. They're just saying, roughly speaking, at the current time of this reserve study being conducted, that this particular wood arbor repair repaint is going to cost roughly $800. And what's it cost in current dollars? Here you can see that they have the estimated useful life and the estimated remaining life, right? So this thing on average should last around 8 years before it needs to be done. This thing right now probably has roughly 2 years left in it before it has to be replaced. And you'll see here some notes, which we'll jump down to in a little bit. I do want to draw your attention to something real quick here that I flagged. That is this particular thing, which the irony of this, it's the very first one on the list. It says the amenity area parking lot repair, seal, and coat, right? You can see that they estimate the useful life being 6 years, but the remaining life being 8 years. I flagged that because nearly always, and I can't think of a reason why, the remaining life would be more than the useful life. It should be that the useful life is more than the remaining life, because you would think that something that's brand new is going to last longer than something that's 3 or 4 years old. So I flagged that only to say that even major providers, like this particular reserve study was conducted by a very large company, even they make mild mistakes. And that mild mistake, thank goodness for this thing, is relatively small, but it could be that they made that same mistake somewhere else and it was a catastrophic mistake because say there was $100,000 thing 5 years from now or 10 years from now, and with inflation, that is now far more than the community has saved for. So I bring that up only to say that look through this stuff because even big companies will make mistakes. And then you'll see that they'll actually do a timeline breakdown, right? So if you look at here, you've got 1, the amenity parking lot, 15 is the wood arbor, 1, the amenity area parking lot, 15 is your wood arbor repair, repaint. So they're going to then map out how often these things need to be replaced over the course of 20 or 40 years, right? So in this case, we'll just look at this one. They say that it needs to be replaced in 2029, right? And it's going to cost $2,853. And then they'll give you another one, right? The second replacement has to be done in 2035, the third replacement in 2041. This particular study was only a 20-year study, so it's not going to go out that far for most of these things. And by the time that 30 years rolls around, the numbers are going to be so different that you're going to have multiple updates to this thing anyways. But you can look at it this way where you can see, okay, in 2029, we have this item that needs to be repaired. I find this somewhat useful. For me, I find these PDFs to be limiting because you have to go back and forth, because telling me that I need to do this in 2029 is only helpful if that's the only item that I have to do that year. But you kind of have to sift through to say, okay, what has to be done in this particular year? Or you can come over here and look at it in this itemized projected cost per year, and you can come down to 2029 and say, okay, we have the amenity parking lot that has to be done. We have the parking lot signs that have to be done. But then you have to come all the way back up into here to check it off or see, okay, what's the next time that we have to do it? Okay, 2035. So when 2029 comes around, did you do it that year or did you not do it that year? Did you kick the can down the road or did you actually fix it before? So while a reserve study is necessary for a community, I think that it's incredibly helpful. I find these particular PDFs somewhat frustrating because it's just not an easy place or an easy way to interact with the data. Whether your community breaks it down by items and elements or they break it down by amenities and locations, sometimes it's easier for people to see it when it's based on like an actual physical location rather than just site work. But by and large, your actual association will have something similar to this delivered to you, where it just breaks everything down on what the item is, what the cost is, how much it's going to cost in 10 years to fix, when does it need to be replaced, and are there any subsequent notes that need to be looked at or justifications for why, which is often going to be found in the notes. Maybe I'll do another video where they break this stuff down differently, where it's the same information, but it's going to be more location based. It might be, the clubhouse, and then they list out all the items that need to be replaced in the clubhouse or around the clubhouse. So you kind of have an idea of when do we need to replace the windows, when do we need to replace the roof or the bathroom or whatever. Like I said, it's just kind of dicing all the same information different ways. And the purpose for doing this, obviously, is because you want to make sure that the community is funded, right? You don't want to come around to 2036 and realize that you have no money in the account, that some major expense comes about that causes you to bankrupt the community or do a major special assessment, which is what's happening a lot of times in places like Florida, where these condos, they're selling condos for 60% of the actual value of it, but it comes with a $50,000 special assessment that the buyer has to take on the debt. So a lot of times communities end up, because they don't financially plan or don't look at this or don't interact with this information, they end up in a financial problem where they don't have enough money to actually meet the needs of the upkeep of the community. So what happens if a community can't afford it? Well, their options are pretty limited. One, they have to take on debt, or they have to take a special assessment, which is oftentimes the community's first step or the thing that they just kind of go to, that because they're not planning far enough ahead, it seems like every year or two or three, they're having to conduct a special assessment and everybody has to pitch in more money rather than having the financial foresight to know that we need to save over a period of time in order to get to where we're fully funded to be able to afford all these things. The other thing is if a community can't afford it, well, a lot of times what they do is just defer the maintenance, right? They just look at it and say, well, we're not going to fix the clubhouse roof. We're, rather than doing it in 2021 in this case, we're going to kick the can down the road and see if we can do it in 2026. And who knows, maybe they make it, maybe it's a gamble and it's, a good decision. More often than not, these things are pretty accurate, and you end up having a roof, which then causes a different issue because now you have to repair the drywall, or if it's a leak that nobody catches for several days, and maybe you have to replace the floors. And yes, sometimes insurance will cover this stuff, but insurance companies, I can guarantee, are going to look into this and say, well, did you have a financial reserve study? Or did you have a capital reserve study in place? And if so, did you replace the items when they were needed? So you can't always rely on insurance, because if you defer the maintenance, it becomes, it becomes your problem, your burden, rather than the insurance company. But some of the worst case scenarios are going to be deferred maintenance where a problem is just ignored over a period of time until it becomes such an issue that you can't ignore it, and you have to fill in the pool, or you have to completely redo the lake because for some reason for a decade people ignored a minor leak that became a major leak that now the entire dam is compromised, and if it breaks, it's going to flood the entire neighborhood or other surrounding areas. So some people are going to ask, how often do you have to have these conducted? And that's a difficult question. I think that it's going to be based on everything from the size of your community, the number of amenities you have, all the way to even state laws. Some laws require reserve studies to be conducted every 3 years. A good rule of thumb, whether it's dictated by state law or not, is every 3 to 5 years, more frequently if you have things that need to be replaced often. So you can see here that they talk about notes, right? So notes, if we come down real quickly, we'll look at this. They're just giving a description of what it is, right? So in this case, note number 2, it's telling you that our observation of the asphalt pavement found to be in poor condition with numerous wide cracks, right? So they're giving you a justification for why they feel like that item needs to be replaced when it does. Retaining walls, fencing, pool and water level, pool furniture. They're just giving you a justification of its condition and why they think that it needs to be repaired or replaced at the schedule that they put it in. A lot of times people in the community just look at the bottom line budget and they say, why do we have $50,000 in the account right now? Why can't we use that to create new pickleball courts or update the pool furniture or whatever it is? They don't necessarily see the financial plan. And that's a huge mistake, right? You don't want the wants of the community to overrule or dictate where the money goes. You have to first look at what are the obligations that the board has to take care of in order to be a good, responsible board member or board making responsible decisions. So don't look at this as just excess money. Look at this as your savings account that's in place because you have financial obligations that are coming up in the future. So this is your plan that you need to look at. Think of this as your financial projections. Another mistake that people make is they think, okay, we've conducted a reserve study, great, right? We've got this thing done, but they rarely look at it. And oftentimes they don't look at it because they're intimidated by the size of this, right? This is not a short document. There's a lot of information in here. If you're not going to take the time to really look into it, it can be overwhelming. So some people just, they don't understand what do we do with this information, and they end up putting this document, on a shelf, so to speak, or filing it away saying, yeah, we had one conducted, but they don't actively engage with it. And that's a problem because things in the community are, needing to be updated and replaced frequently. What happens if a storm blows through Florida and rips the roof off the clubhouse? Well, according to this, maybe it needs to be replaced in 2036, but are you going to wait until 2036 to fix it? No, you're going to fix it immediately. Insurance may cover that cost, but now your entire reserve study is thrown off whack because now all the details are no longer relevant because the timeline is thrown off. So you really have to look at these things frequently and update them frequently. Unfortunately, when a reserve study provides you with a PDF, it becomes like this locked-in thing. I'm not a reserve study provider, so I don't have a financial gain by how frequently you update these things. But unfortunately, reserve study specialists, they do make money on how frequently they either conduct a reserve study or update a reserve study. So it's in their best interest. I understand why they do it, to give it to you in a PDF where you're almost beholden to them to come back to them to ask for them to do a new reserve study or update the reserve study just because something happened in the community that caused your timeline to be thrown off, whatever that reason might be. Another common mistake is what we were talking about earlier of looking at inflation and what affects the cost of things. Again, they're looking at the cost of what this is in today's numbers, right? So this particular thing today might cost $5,000, but if it's scheduled to be replaced in 15 years, I guarantee that same $5,000 isn't going to be true, right? So here they say it's in $10,000. So we would have to come back up to here and find out, when is this scheduled to be repaired? So pool filter and pump is scheduled to be repaired in 2025. So in 2025, the estimated cost is $5,600, but here the next replacement is 2035. They're estimating that the replacement cost is $7,500, which, assuming inflation at 3% remains true, that might be an accurate number. But what if, for whatever reason, there's a tariff that's put on pool filters, and now that cost jumps up to $15,000 versus $7,000? So you have to kind of constantly be looking at this stuff, because you can't just assume that once it was conducted once, it's forever accurate. It's not. This information, it really needs to be updated frequently. Another mistake that people make is they view these capital improvements with reserve expenses, right? They look at like, well, we have $50,000 in the account, let's build a new playground, right? That's something that would fall under the category of a capital improvement rather than a capital reserve or capital expense, right? So you can't look at this as, we have $50,000, let's throw it away by building something that doesn't already exist. No, you have to look at it to say, what do we have coming up that $50,000 has to be allocated for? Now, you might have $100,000, but you only need $50,000 over the next 10 years. So maybe you do have excess funds that's used elsewhere that can actually go to a capital improvement thing. But don't confuse a capital improvement with a reserve study or a reserve fund. Those things need to be distinguished because they really are two different things. So I do encourage you to look at your reserve fund frequently. I mean, I can't stress that enough. I would say as much as every month or every quarter. Even if you set your budget for the year and you know what needs to come up in 2025, right? What items need to be replaced, but you may or may not replace all those items. So you need to kind of constantly be looking at this stuff to ensure that, are you following the plan? And if you're not following the plan, where did you deter? Did you kick something down to next year? Well, what does that impact next year? Are you able to afford the items for next year, even though some of them were scheduled for this year? And that's exactly why I find this type of stuff, I mean, it's useful. I think these people are experts, but I also find the way that they deliver them not always the most helpful, because you're then stuck in the situation of having to like become a project manager with this, based on a PDF where it's not very dynamic. And that's primarily one of the main reasons why we added the reserve study integration into our software. I'm not going to get into our software right now, just because the purpose of this is to show you how to read a reserve study. In order to make this most effective, you need to work with it, interact with it frequently, and I would argue that it has to be put into a format that can dynamically change based on the needs of the community and be updated in real time, which I'll cover in a different video when I talk about our actual software. Anyway, I hope you found this quick look at the reserve study helpful. I hope it helps you understand how to read one. And if you have any questions or you want me to take a look at your particular reserve study, if you have questions about it, again, I'm not a reserve study provider, so I have no financial gain in conducting a reserve study. I don't conduct them. I can give you ideas on how to conduct them yourself and give you a lot of recommendations and the tools to do that. But if you have any questions or you want me to look at your particular reserve study, I'm happy to do that. Just reach out to me directly. All right, see you on the next video. Thanks.